In the Roman Empire's most powerful years, not all slaves were bought for labor, agriculture, or war. Among the most coveted were the delicati, young male slaves selected for their physical beauty, refined manners, and ability to blend seamlessly into the luxury of elite households. Their value lay not in strength, but in elegance, charm, and presentation. The center of this trade was the Forum Boarium, the ancient cattle market of Rome, transformed into a hub for human commerce. Here, slave traders displayed boys on raised platforms, each wearing a placard around the neck. The placard was more than a name tag. It was a marketing sheet listing their place of origin, skills, age, and physical attributes. An elegant boy from Greece or Asia Minor could fetch far more than one from rural Italy, purely because Roman buyers believed certain regions produced more cultured servants. The demand for beauty over utility distorted Roman economics. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century CE, mocked this obsession, noting that a curly-haired boy could cost more than a farm, an outrageous comparison that exposed the elite's indulgence. Historical records confirm that some delicati sold for prices higher than a fully trained gladiator or even an entire countryside villa. For perspective, the cost of such a slave could equal decades of a soldier's wages. In elite Roman society, owning a delicatus was more than a sign of wealth. It was a status statement, a silent announcement that the owner had both the money and the cultural refinement to maintain a human ornament within the household. Geographic origins and supply chain. The delicati did not all come from Rome's heartland. They were drawn from across the empire and beyond, sourced through a vast and efficient supply chain that turned human beings into high-value commodities. The most sought-after boys often came from Greece, Thrace, Syria, Phrygia, Cappadocia, and Galatia, regions the Romans associated with refinement, education, and natural beauty. For many, the journey to Rome began in war. Defeated cities were stripped not only of their wealth, but of their youth. Boys were marched in chains to ports or along Roman roads, passing through slave depots where they were assessed, sorted, and sent toward markets in the empire's major cities. Others entered the system without a battle being fought, sold directly by desperate families in famine-stricken provinces, exchanging their children for grain, livestock, or debt forgiveness. Roman buyers were deeply influenced by stereotypes. Greek slaves, for instance, were thought to possess elegance and intelligence. Thracians were praised for their physical strength and striking features, and Syrians were prized for their manners and adaptability to urban life. These prejudices shaped market prices and opened the door for deception. Historical records reveal that slave traders sometimes falsified origins to drive up profits. A boy from Cappadocia might be branded as Greek simply because a Greek label could double his value. Traders used forged documentation or instructed the boys to speak only in certain dialects during inspection. This manipulation played on the Roman elite's belief that beauty, refinement, and cultural sophistication could be bought if you knew where to shop. By the time these boys reached Rome, they had already passed through the hands of multiple middlemen, each increasing the price. The result was a human pipeline feeding the capital's demand for beauty and service, one that operated in full view, yet without moral scrutiny from the society it served. Life after purchase. For a delicatus, the day of purchase was not the end of their ordeal. It was the beginning of a carefully controlled existence inside the walls of an elite Roman household. These boys were not sent to toil in fields or build aqueducts. Instead, they became part of the luxury machinery that maintained the image of Rome's aristocracy. Once assigned to a household, their lives revolved around grooming, presentation, and service. Mornings could begin with elaborate preparation, bathing, oiling the skin, arranging the hair, ensuring they appeared flawless before their masters or guests. They were trained in the art of movement, taught to walk, stand, and serve with a grace that reflected the prestige of the owner. Those with musical ability were taught to play the lyre or flute, Others learned to recite poetry or perform in choreographed dances. Appearances were everything. Even when not actively serving, they had to remain within sight, poised and ready, reinforcing the atmosphere of refinement. These roles required constant discipline. A misplaced gesture, an improper posture, or a moment of visible fatigue could draw sharp reprimands or punishment. Evidence of their hidden inner lives occasionally surfaces. In Pompeii, archaeologists uncovered wall graffiti believed to have been scratched by enslaved boys. Crude drawings and short inscriptions, possibly the only safe outlet for self-expression in an environment where speaking openly could invite danger. These faint marks, preserved under volcanic ash, offer a rare and humanizing glimpse into minds otherwise erased from history. The value placed on these boys went beyond their skills or obedience. Wealthy Roman households sometimes insured their most beautiful slaves against disfigurement, treating them like priceless works of art. Contracts could specify compensation if a servant suffered injury that reduced their physical appeal, a stark reminder that in the eyes of their owners, they were investments to be protected, displayed, and if necessary, replaced. This life of constant observation, luxury without freedom, and beauty turned into a commodity created a strange, gilded cage, one that trapped its occupants in a performance they could never leave. Castration as control. Within the highest levels of Roman power, control over enslaved boys could take an even more extreme form: castration. These altered servants, known as spadones, occupied sensitive and prestigious roles inside imperial courts. They served emperors, high-ranking senators, and members of the imperial family, often becoming a constant presence in private chambers, ceremonial events, and behind-the-scenes political dealings. The practice revealed one of Rome's deepest cultural contradictions. Publicly, Roman writers and politicians mocked what they called Eastern effeminacy, pointing to the Persian and other Eastern courts where eunuchs were common. Privately, many of Rome's most influential figures adopted the same practice. They valued eunuchs for one primary reason: absolute control. A eunuch could not produce heirs, could not threaten a family's bloodline, and was thought to be entirely dependent on his master. Some castrations were performed for a very specific purpose: to preserve a boy's high-pitched singing voice. In elite households, and especially in the emperor's inner circle, such voices were considered rare and precious. These boys became elite court entertainers, performing music and recitations during banquets and private gatherings. Their value increased with their rarity, and their altered bodies ensured that their voices never deepened. This was not only morally disturbing, but also legally questionable. The Lex Cornelia, a Roman law, officially banned the practice of castration. However, enforcement was inconsistent, especially when the wealthy and politically powerful were involved. Historical evidence shows that Roman doctors, trusted by the elite, secretly carried out these procedures for a high fee, often using crude and dangerous methods. Without modern surgical knowledge, many boys suffered lifelong health problems or died from infection. Risks the owners accepted if it meant keeping the boy's appearance or voice intact. By the late Empire, the presence of eunuchs in court had become an open secret. They were symbols of luxury, exclusivity, and total domination, living proof that in Rome's upper echelons, even the law could be bent or broken if the price and the status reward were high enough. Inside the imperial household. Life inside Rome's imperial household was a study in contradictions. A place of marble halls, gold-embroidered fabrics, and endless luxury, yet also of absolute control and constant surveillance. Enslaved boys who entered this inner circle became part of a finely tuned machine, where every gesture and every word was calculated to reflect the emperor's image. Their duties ranged from the ceremonial to the intensely personal. They poured wine for guests during imperial banquets, prepared the emperor's baths, carried messages between high-ranking officials, and served as attendants in private chambers. They were never out of sight for long. Constant supervision ensured loyalty, obedience, and perfection in service. In such an environment, mistakes were not tolerated, and punishment could be immediate and severe. One of the most infamous examples of imperial control was the case of Sporus, a young slave brought into Emperor Nero's circle. Ancient historian Suetonius recounts how Nero arranged for Sporus to undergo physical alteration, dressed him in fine women's garments, and held a public ceremony, calling him his wife. Sporus accompanied the emperor at public events, sitting beside him as though part of the imperial family. To Nero, this was less about affection and more about theatre, a display of his ability to reshape reality itself to suit his desires. The imperial palace was also a stage for extreme indulgence. Emperor Elagabalus once hosted banquets served entirely by boys dressed as Cupid, each carrying golden bows and arrows. Guests were entertained not just with food and music, but with living symbols of power, beauty, and luxury. Every detail was designed to impress, intimidate, and reinforce the emperor's supremacy. In such a world, even political affairs intertwined with the lives of these enslaved boys. Some palace eunuchs were entrusted with carrying confidential political messages, a task reserved for those considered completely loyal, not by choice, but by necessity. Their inability to form dynasties made them seem safe messengers, but the stakes were high. If a eunuch was suspected of betrayal, execution was swift and without trial. Within the imperial household, these boys and young men lived at the very center of Rome's power. Yet they remained powerless, their identities shaped and controlled entirely by those they served. They were ornaments in times of celebration, tools in times of politics, and expendable liabilities in times of suspicion. Cultural symbolism and elite displays. In Rome's elite culture, the delicati were more than servants. They were living symbols, carefully groomed to project refinement, sophistication, and wealth. Their training often began immediately after purchase. Those with natural musical talent were taught to play the lyre, flute, or cithara. Others were drilled in the recitation of poetry, learning verses from Homer, Virgil, and Ovid until they could perform them flawlessly for guests. Dance was another cultivated skill, not as free expression, but as a choreographed display designed to please the eye and impress the audience. Their public appearances were staged with the precision of theatre. At banquets, they moved silently between couches, pouring wine and serving delicacies, while embodying perfect posture and grace. In public bathhouses reserved for the upper class, they attended to the needs of their masters, carrying towels, oils, and perfumes, a quiet but constant reminder of the owner's elevated social position. The presence of such attendants told guests that the host was not merely wealthy, but also culturally refined, someone who could afford to invest in the training and maintenance of human beings as ornaments. The Delicatus thus became a status marker, as visible as marble statues or silver tableware. Art from the period reinforces this role. Certain Roman frescoes depict enslaved boys in mythological scenes, alongside gods like Apollo, the deity of beauty, music, and the arts. By placing them in these divine contexts, artists elevated the boys' appearance to an almost sacred level, while also reinforcing the prestige of the household that owned them. These images blurred the line between mortal servant and divine figure, making the Delicatus both a work of art and a living advertisement of elite power. For the boys themselves, such displays offered no true honor. They were not celebrated for who they were, but for how well they could embody an ideal created by others, an ideal in which their own voices and identities had no place. Risks, political intrigue, and punishment. The life of a Delicatus in an elite or imperial household was a constant balancing act. Beauty and grace might grant access to the inner chambers of power, but they offered no protection from the dangers that came with that proximity. Favor was a fragile thing in Rome's upper echelons. A single misstep, a careless word, or even being associated with the wrong faction could end a slave's privileged position overnight. Punishment for falling out of favor could be swift and brutal. Some were beaten publicly as an example to others. Others were quietly imprisoned in remote storerooms or underground chambers, their absence never mentioned again. Execution, especially in imperial households, required no legal process. It was a matter of the master's will. Historical accounts describe the darker corners of this world. Tiberius's villa on the island of Capri became infamous for stories of cruelty and abuse, while Roman historians like Suetonius and Tacitus sometimes exaggerated to tarnish political rivals. The consistency of these reports suggests that enslaved boys and attendants were at real risk of exploitation and violence. In these secluded estates, far from the oversight of the Senate or public scrutiny, the emperor's word was absolute law. Political intrigue added another layer of danger. Serving in the imperial household meant being near confidential conversations and witnessing alliances, betrayals, and plots. If a delicatus was suspected of passing information, whether true or imagined, the consequences could be fatal. Loyalty was expected, but loyalty alone was never a guarantee of safety. In this environment, survival depended on a combination of obedience, discretion, and luck. A boy might be the favored attendant one day, a forgotten or condemned servant the next. The same qualities that made them valuable, beauty, intelligence, and proximity to power, also made them vulnerable in a court where envy, suspicion, and political maneuvering were constant undercurrents. Closing reflection. To be a delicatus in the Roman Empire was to live at the very center of power, yet remain utterly powerless. These boys stood beside emperors, senators, and generals, serving in halls where decisions shaped the fate of nations, but their own fates were never their own to decide. They could witness history in the making, but never be part of it except as silent participants. Rome's grandeur, celebrated for centuries in marble monuments and epic literature, was built not only on military conquest and engineering genius, but also on systems of control and exploitation hidden behind polished facades. The elegance of the imperial court, the sophistication of its banquets, and the refinement of its art were inseparable from the human suffering that made such displays possible. This is the paradox. The same society that championed philosophy, law, and beauty also institutionalized practices that stripped individuals of identity, autonomy, and dignity. The Delicatus was a living reminder that in Rome, refinement and cruelty could exist side by side, and often one fed the other. It is a truth that resonates beyond the ancient world. Luxury can mask oppression, and culture can coexist with cruelty when those in power choose image over justice. The lives of these boys, celebrated for their beauty yet erased from the record, challenge us to question the moral cost of grandeur. And so we return to the warning posed by the satirist Juvenal. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Who will guard the guards themselves? In Rome, as in every age, the question remains unanswered.